All right. Okay, let's get into it. So, this is going to be a bit of a reset episode. Okay. And this is the first proper episode, really, that is being shared on YouTube. I talked last week about my reservations and doubts about coming onto YouTube, even though it's been in the cards for quite some time. And I thought it would be really useful because there's been a massive, I think, shift. I shouldn't say massive, a subtle shift, but significant shift that has happened over probably the last maybe 2 weeks or so. I've really noticed a different kind of thinker and reader and watcher engaging with my content on TikTok and Substack over the last few weeks. And it has occurred to me that, of course, if you are just coming across some of my content now, you don't necessarily have the backstory as to why Unpunishable Woman, what the core tenets of being an unpunishable woman are. And I think that is contributing to some of the responses that I have been receiving over the last couple of weeks. I thought it would be really helpful and important to reset the room, as it were, introduce myself and introduce Unpunishable Woman, what it means, and why I began sharing my ideas about what it means to be an unpunishable woman in September 2025, I believe. Right, so Unpunishable Woman. Why Unpunishable Woman? What does that mean? So essentially, I believe that women have been punished, okay, anytime they have stepped outside of the norms of society, culture, religion, and family. And when I say norms, I'm really talking about systems of power, okay, systems of power that have created and then enforced invisible contracts into not only culture, but also into the nervous system of women. I genuinely believe that it's not just external conditioning and programming that impacts on a subconscious level the reasons why women make some of the decisions that they make, the reason why women choose or not choose certain lifestyles. And of course, there is a very prescriptive route, channel, path is the word I'm looking for, really, that women are expected to take. And that is embedded within us from girlhood with a sprinkling of shame, fear, guilt, and punishment, the fear of punishment. And punishment isn't only, I think for a lot of people, when they think of punishment, you may be thinking about the law primarily, okay? Or you might be thinking about physical punishment that usually, parents will dole out to their children, okay, should they do something that parents think is wrong, etc. But I'm talking about punishment on a much deeper level, right? Actually, if you look at the history of women anyway, there have been women who are physically punished, okay, for just being in existence. But often when they are making decisions, when they're speaking up, when they're speaking out, when they don't fall in line. So there's definitely a very real physical punishment element to this. When we look back historically and even actually in modern times, there are certain things that women face and experience that you could absolutely classify as punishment that have real world physical impacts on women. And one of the things we have to remember as well, there's a long history of women being harmed and women being ended when they have lived outside of the societal norms. And you can look at, history in multiple places on the earth and see the truth of that, okay? And so, punishment is not just physical. It can also be social, it can be financial, it can be emotional. And each system of power has their own set of punishments, okay, that they often make women aware of. If you step outside, if you do something different, then this is a potential punishment and or consequence. And one of the things that I realized about 7 years ago is that in order for me to liberate myself, in order for me to reclaim my authority over myself as a woman, specifically as a single woman, and I'll come on to that later as to why that's relevant and why I speak about modern single womanhood so much. I would need to break the invisible contracts that these systems of power have created and seek to enforce on a nervous system deep level. So it's not simply about identifying the invisible contract at play, but it's also about understanding how the fear of punishment, how some of the punishments that are always on standby have impacted your sense of internal safety within your nervous system. Now, if you don't know, okay, we have our conscious mind and then we have the subconscious. And actually, most of our actions and decisions, the way we see ourselves, the way we show up in the world, is driven by the subconscious, by the nervous system. Okay. And the nervous system is almost like a security system. It's a safety detector. And our nervous system has decided what is safe and what is not safe. And it does that over a period of time. Since birth, it's been doing that. Now, even if you do your research on science and pregnancy, in many ways, newborns can inherit, as it were, the nervous system template of their mother and or the primary caregiver. And so when it comes to our body deciding what is safe and what is not safe, it is often taking its cues from what we have witnessed, what we have experienced from girlhood onwards. And so as adults, quite often we are making decisions, we are seeing ourselves based on the experiences we've had in childhood, and specifically the nervous system's classification of what is safe and what is not. And so that is an important piece of knowledge, I think, for women in general. Okay, it is more than skin deep. It's not just about external programming. Okay, it has been reinforced. It has been rewarded. So, for example, for women who do what society expects you to do, okay, and some of the big obvious ones, of course, are, let's take it back a little bit more. So from girlhood, you are encouraged to be obedient to your parents, okay? And specifically, if you have a father, be obedient to that head of household. You are expected as you move into girlhood, young womanhood, to be humble as a woman, okay? Humility is ever so important for women. And then the real trajectory is that you move into marriage where you have this husbandly owner, and you submit. Can you see that pipeline? Obedience, humility, submission. That is the pipeline for women. If you are following a patriarchal and misogynistic script, okay? And systems of power, like the family system of power, which is the first system of power we are introduced into as young girls, as babies, okay? Systems of power, family. Marriage in itself is a system of power. Motherhood is a system of power. It operates like that. Systems of power, religion is a system of power. Okay? These systems of power reinforce these invisible contracts. Contracts that women learn on a body deep level, that in order to stay safe, in order to belong, in order to be accepted, we must obey them. We must keep the agreement. Even though we didn't consciously agree to them, we must keep the agreement. And we witness the fact that when other women in our lives, or women we see out in the world, women we see nowadays on social media, when they don't obey the invisible contract in order to survive, have approval, be accepted, okay, be liked, be chosen and selected, usually by men, what happens to them? And so along the way, our body is constantly detecting and trying to discern how it can simply keep you safe and keep you alive. That's what the nervous system is there for. It's incredibly intelligent in many ways. But the problem is that you might want to do something new, different, something that doesn't follow the norm. You might want to break some of these invisible contracts and liberate yourself. The problem with that is that anything new or different for your nervous system is probably classified as a threat, not as safety. So even if the thing that you want, the thing that you desire, okay, and these there's multiple levels to this. It doesn't always obviously have to be about marriage, motherhood. It can be anything new that you want, that you think will be healthy for you in the short term, the long term. Because it's new or different, your nervous system is going to classify it as a threat. And it's going to remind you of all the times in the past that you did something different, you said something different, and you were punished, and or there was a consequence. It's going to remind you, because it's incredibly intelligent, of all the times that women, more generally, women who look like you, women you are related to, women you know, trust, respect, care about, when they broke invisible contracts, when they defied norms, when they decided that they weren't going to allow systems of power to enforce an invisible contract in their lives. You witnessed what happened to them. And so your nervous system is simply trying to keep you safe and in the familiar, even if the familiar isn't that great for you, even if you don't want it. Okay? And this is something that I learned acutely 7 years ago. Because back then I was in a religion that I was raised in. And it's really interesting when you look at religion as a system of power, punishment and the fear of punishment is a consistent and key tool or lever that it as a system of power uses. And I want to be very clear here that there is a difference between religion and faith and spirituality. There is a difference, okay? And historically and factually speaking, religion does operate as a system of power. Okay, and some of the largest religions around the world literally operate as organizations, institutions, and legal entities. So, you might be a rank and file member of a church, of a congregation, etc., and you might not have any concept of this. But talk to people who actually have worked, whether they're paid or volunteers rather, in some of these churches and religions. They are organizations. They have policies, they have systems. A lot of them function like legal entities. They have to be sometimes legal entities in order to benefit from certain provisions that the government has put in place. So they may, for example, have charity status, which then feeds into, for example, tax and tax liabilities, right? And so religion, especially organized religion, is a system of power. That is what it is. Now, that is not therefore a commentary necessarily on your faith and or spirituality if you have one. And so what I realized and experienced unexpectedly is that when I was assaulted, I did what I had been conditioned and programmed to do. I followed the rules. And so I told the elders in my congregation. And what happened afterwards was essentially I was punished. I was put through an internal judicial process. And at the end of it, I was punished. I was, assessed as to whether or not I was clean enough to remain in the congregation. And that's a quote. And I was punished. And I really grappled with it on so many levels, on an identity level, on a faith and spirituality level. It was an experience that changed me on a cellular level, because what I came to realize internally on a body deep level before I could articulate it and before I eventually left that religion is that I was being punished, one. But two, it was made very clear to me that unless I accepted the punishment, there would be consequences, even though I had done nothing wrong. Right? And there's so much I can talk about when it comes to the invisible contracts in relation to women and religion. Okay. But I realized in my darkest moments, there was always a little bit of clarity. Okay. There was that part of me there that I knew, no, actually, in order for me to regain my self respect, my dignity, my sense of self and self worth, I had to reject the things that I had been told were right. Okay. I had to reject the punishment. I had to get to a place where I did not fear punishment, whether that was divine punishment, eternal punishment. And it's really interesting because, you know, if you've ever been brought up in an Abrahamic religion, specifically Christianity, the fear of God is a concept that you will be taught, and it depends on how you're taught it. Sometimes you're taught that, you know, to have a fear of God is to have so much love for God that you wouldn't want to displease him, for example, right? So I'm always aware that if you're listening to this, you may have been taught different things about what fear of God actually means. But I realized I had to reject on a body deep level the fear of being punished should I decide to reclaim my dignity, my self-respect. Okay. And in those moments, I, you know, voiced my concerns about what was happening. I voiced my concern about what I knew was misapplication of scripture, misinterpretation of scripture. And so that was met, of course, with what can only be described as, you know, spiritual and emotional abuse. But that experience, which I have talked about in the past, was in many ways the best thing that could have ever happened to me. And I want to share something with you which will really lock in this piece around invisible contracts, and that the fact that these systems of power create them, they enforce them within the psyche and the nervous system of people, right? And I had 4 meetings in total with the elders. And in the 3rd meeting, which was the worst one of them all overall, something very interesting was said to me. And I've never heard truer words, bearing in mind I had been in this religion my entire life. And, you know, the the whole, you know, it's very common for people to say, this is the truth, this is the real truth. But I've never heard truer words. My entire body and mind understood what was being said to me was the truth, even though a lot of the other things that were said to me were just downright, as I say, abusive, wrong, degrading, humiliating. But this one sentence rang true. The elders said to me, this is what you signed up for. And specifically, they said, this is what you signed up for when you became part of the congregation. And I remember my entire body, ironically relaxed. You know, what had been a series of very uncomfortable, you know, and traumatic meetings, in that moment, my body fully relaxed, because one thing about me is when I hear truth, I respond. I'm very inclined towards truth and fact. I always have been. And ironically, that was one of the main reasons why I joined that religion. I officially got baptized, even though I was raised in it. I officially got baptized at the age of 15. And if you would ask me then, and I have talked about this funny enough before I even left the religion, one of the things for me that was key was that I believed it was a place where truth and fact were the cornerstone, right? With the foundation. And I am somebody who, yeah, that's my thing, right? I don't like it when people lie. I don't like lies, really, I don't. And so when I heard that, and it was said, you know, more than once, this is what you signed up for when you became part of the congregation, I realized that meant I could sign out. Right? It called to mind that, yes, I was young when I got baptized, but that's okay, because clearly I didn't read the terms and conditions. Right? I didn't read the terms and conditions. At that age, really, I didn't really understand the invisible contract element of religion, right? And so it was really that period of time that taught me the importance of being unpunishable. Because ultimately, because I had signed up, I therefore signed up for punishment to be administered that I could not question. I was told outright, you do not have a right to any more information. We are not obligated to tell you anything, right? So it really settled in for me that I had been sleepwalking essentially through my entire life, actually. And I had been obeying and agreeing through behavior, compliance, conformity to these invisible contracts. Because, yes, I didn't want to be punished. I didn't want divine punishment from God in this life or the next, in fact, right? And I didn't want to be extricated. I did not want to be disfellowshipped, as it were, from the only place I had been a part of for my entire life. This was my entire community, in many ways, family. And so I found myself at some points during those 4 meetings in total with the elders, complying with things that I knew were wrong in order to remain. Because that's the other thing, right? The process is an assessment of whether or not you're going to stay in the congregation or not. And at the time, given this was all a shock to me, I wasn't expecting it, never had been through a judicial process before, I wanted to remain. And that meant I had to avoid punishment. But in order to avoid punishment, I would have to obey invisible contracts, some of which I weren't even aware of, some of which were humiliating, degrading, traumatic, and painful in the short term and the long term, quite frankly. Right? And so this is why when I talk about being unpunishable, it takes you to another level as a woman, but it does require you to identify the invisible contracts at play in your life. Now, for me, the biggest one was religion and the associated invisible contracts. For you, it may be other things, right? And so you have to identify the invisible contracts, and then you have to be willing to break them. And breaking them is not easy. It's not pretty. I've talked about this before, right? It's sometimes brute force is required. Yeah. People aren't going to support you. People aren't going to approve. Some people's backs are going to be, they're not going to like it. And actually, as well, the more truth, ironically, that you speak in the process of breaking invisible contracts, the more uncomfortable people become, right? And I know people get really uncomfortable. There's certain people who know me who get very uncomfortable when I talk about that particular experience because it's exposing quite often. And not least because it's inexcusable and wrong. What will happen is people try to justify it. They'll try to explain it away. And there's all the things about blaming me, about saying that I'm misunderstood, I'm misheard, when none of that is true at all. Okay. And that's another thing as well. In general, systems of power need you as a woman to distrust yourself, distrust your reality and your consciousness. And so one of the things they will need to do is convince you, gaslight you, sometimes even rewrite the narrative, which is what happened in my case, or just ignore and try to silence you. And so it is really important that women in general recognize the number of invisible contracts at play, contracts that we continue to sign and agree to through our behavior and our choices. And when you go to break those invisible contracts, it does cause a rupture in your personal life, sometimes your professional life, okay? And you may, in my case, my life is completely different to the way it was 7 years ago. Okay, so that's what I mean by being unpunishable. Now, there are 3 core pillars that make up unpunishability. One is to be rooted, to know who you are. And remember that you are the authority on who you are, not other people. Yeah, 7 years ago, there was a moment where I had to sit with myself and say, hold on a minute. These men don't get to tell me who I am. They don't get to tell me who I am in God's eyes. That's either. When you're being told that this is a reflection of God's love for you, I had to really bring it back. Yeah, they weren't there when I was assaulted. So how can they tell me what happened and what his intention was and what my intentions were, right? I had to reclaim the rightful authority that I have over who I am, okay, and how I'm seen. I realized I had indeed outsourced that. I was allowing other people and a system of power to tell me how God saw me, especially in a very dark time. And so being rooted means you need to know who you are, you need to value who you are, and you need to reclaim the authority over who you say you are and who you become and who you are being. Who you are being. And by the way, it belongs to you. So you can change, you can rebrand, you can change your mind. You see, we live in a world that tells women you can't change your past, right? You can't change how you're perceived. That's why I find it really interesting, all these conversations when misogynistic men will say that a woman's past should dictate and govern how a man treats her. It should dictate and govern how the world sees her forever. No. You are the authority on who you are. And the thing about being an unpunishable woman is, contrary to what systems of power want you to believe, you do not have to be perfect. And if we look at the evidence, the data, the research, the statistics, that even for women, okay, who try to be perfect, women who are the good women who share, they do all the things, they say all the things, they dress the way they need to dress, they still are unprotected. They still are oppressed. And I can tell you that from personal experience. All right. I was the good sister in the congregation. I was the good sister to my siblings. I was the good daughter. I was all the good things, genuinely, full-heartedly, wholeheartedly. Okay. I believed in my soul it was the right thing to do. And my goodness, the way I was dragged like a carcass through the desert, but that was my awakening. Because in that moment, I had to grow up. I had to mature. I had to mature and see things for what they were, not what I had been taught them to be and not what I was hoping they were, right? Every single thing that I thought meant something, was almost this, kind of almost, I don't know, life credit, value credit in the bank for being this good person. Worthless. Absolutely worthless, because it did not protect me, one, from assault, and two, from the aftermath of that punishment from a system of power that I trusted in. My entire life oriented around my faith. Yeah, my entire future as I saw it, my entire future as I had planned it, in terms of, of hopefully, if I am faithful enough, being able to demonstrate to God himself that I truly recognize his sovereignty, truly recognize that, he has a right to rule, truly through my habits, my patterns, my life, I will show him that I'm not against him, that I want to be approved of by him, all of that. Yeah. Gone. Challenged. I was completely destabilized, shocked. There are no words. I don't think I can find words to truly describe how humiliating, degrading, sobering, humbling. I shouldn't use the word humbling really, because it was a humiliation, but it really destroyed who I am, or who I was, right? On a cellular level, that entire period of my life changed who I am. And so being rooted is important, but in yourself, not rooted in systems of power. And then the next thing is being regulated. Like I said earlier, when I learned how the nervous system works, one, that it exists, and two, how it works. And I started to learn about my nervous system, because it's one thing when you extract yourself from a system of power, when you recognize the system of power exists, that is what it is. But then there's that next step of being able to almost remap your nervous system's safety and threat detection. Because when you're making changes, when you're doing something new or different, your nervous system is there to keep you safe, keep you in the familiar if necessary, okay? It doesn't want you to die. It doesn't want you to be unsafe. And actually what it wants you to do is feel accepted, feel as if you belong, because that is what safety usually involves. And so when you notice, when you first realize, right, this is a system of power, these are the invisible contracts that are at play in my life, and then you want to break them, the bit that people struggle with is one, maintaining new pathways, new habits, etc. And two, believing them, believing it's possible and being able to sustain it. It's your nervous system. And so learning, I had to dig deep into nervous system work in order to really make certain changes stick. The way I was thinking, the way I felt about myself and past experiences, the decisions I was making to move forward. You know, in just a few years, I paid off multiple six figures in debt. I lost over £100 and I've been maintaining that loss. I moved country, right? There's a lot of things I did in the last 5 years. If I hadn't have been doing the work on my nervous system or work with my nervous system, I wouldn't be able to maintain and sustain these changes and the person I am today. Okay, that's why being regulated is a core pillar of being unpunishable. It is really it's your companion as a woman, because anytime punishment feels as if it's coming your way, or you detect a consequence for being who you really want to be and liberating yourself, your nervous system is going to kick into action, right? What we need our nervous system to do is trust us. What we need our nervous system to do is recognize when we're making decisions that are healthy or decisions that we desire, okay, things that we desire, that it can work with us so that we can maintain and sustain that new way of thinking, being, etc., etc. The third key pillar of being unpunishable, of course, is being resourced, well-resourced. And this is probably one of the key pillars that I've talked about on TikTok in particular, that I think a lot of people have met me through, right? Where I talk about single women in particular, but this applies to all women, having their own resources and infrastructure in their life, right? So money is one thing, but also creating infrastructure and the importance of having more money than you need. You see, it was my competence and ability to provide for myself that was the glue when I had to leave that religion. It was the glue when I knew that I'm going to have to leave and this could potentially have an impact on everything. Who talks to me, who doesn't talk to me. And given that 99.9% of my life was in that religion, friendships, everything. And so I knew the one thing I didn't doubt is I can provide for myself. And I can create infrastructure in my life to support me existing in my life and living well. And when we look historically and typically, one of the main reasons why women remain in systems of power, okay, that are harmful. One of the main reasons why women remain in, situations that are unhealthy is because they lack resources. They lack their own resources and they also lack their own route to resource. This is why I'm always talking about women learning how to sell, women learning how to ask for money, not from men. And you may have heard me talk about that. That's one of my maxims in life. Money doesn't come from men. No. Right? And so it's important that for women, and specifically single women, because if you don't have a partner, if you don't have family that you can rely on or ask for money from, you need to have your own money and you need to have your own means of making money, and not through a man. Because anytime you're relying on another imperfect human being, there's no guarantee there, and it's not an insurance. All right? So that's why I talk about being well-resourced, because ultimately you need resources, you need infrastructure as a woman if you're going to be unpunishable, because you are already often defying the norms. You're breaking invisible contracts. And what systems of power do is they let you know, if you don't do this, we will do this. If you don't do this, we will withdraw this. You look at most systems of power, that's how it goes. Okay, and the thing is, sometimes when you're leaving a system of power, it is what it is. You don't want what they tell you the benefits and advantages are of staying, right? But ultimately, okay, there are consequences. And one of the ways that you can smooth that journey out, or the word I'm looking for is a bit weird, but lubricate the journey, because it's one of a lot of friction, resistance of all kinds, right, is by being well resourced and having your own infrastructure in your life. So that's what it means to be unpunishable. Those are the three core pillars. And that's really the origin story of how I realized, one, that I was afraid of punishment, and that had obviously guided my life up until that point, okay? And that it was necessary for me to break invisible contracts in order to become unpunishable. And what it means is now, I make decisions from a very different place. I do not live in existential dread or fear. Okay, I know who I am, and I understand what the consequences and or what the perceived risk could be every time I say, hold on a minute, you don't get to control how I see myself. You don't get to control how I'm going to function. Absolutely not, right? There are consequences to that. And then what I will do in this, I guess, piece is talk about why single women. There's so much more I could share with you, but in this piece, I'll lastly talk about why single women. So, number one, I am a single woman by choice. Okay. And I grew up again in a religion where there's a distinct difference between the way married women and single women are perceived and treated. And that isn't unique really to that religion. That is across the board. You can see if you look across the world, different cultures, etc., whether it's on a structural systemic level or on an interpersonal level, right? Okay, single women are treated very differently. They are perceived differently. They're often misunderstood, pathologized, dismissed. And there are so many examples. You can go and do your own research. Okay, there was in the past a lot of social stigma around being single. You were often portrayed as undesirable. Okay, and these days people really want all single women to be sad and lonely and depressed. Now, I'm not saying there aren't women who are single by circumstance and that's how they feel. Their feelings are valid. That should be honored. There should be space held for that. However, okay, systems of power really need women, okay, to go down the route of partnering with a man particularly and specifically, but also procreating. Okay, I just watched a really interesting video about the declining birth rate and what that means for the world. And the truth of the matter is, if, for example, women decided not to have babies for 10 years, this would collapse countless industries, right? And so when you are a single woman and you've opted out of systems of power like marriage and motherhood, okay, there are consequences. There are social consequences, there are financial consequences, there are structural consequences. And the world is not set up for single women to thrive. Okay, really at best it should be a waiting room whereby eventually you go and partner with a man and eventually you procreate. And so as a single woman, one of the things that I found frustrating, and I still find it frustrating at times, is that there's a glut of content online telling single women how undesirable they are, what they need to do to get a man, find a man and keep a man, how to be feminine, how to find a provider man, and as a single woman with, other interests, okay, I really, at 37, I'm not interested in content that's, still talking about who pays on the first date or talking about body count. Yeah, no, that's not of any interest and it's not stimulating at all. There is so much more to me as a human being. And I didn't see media platforms, I didn't see content that was really talking about modern single womanhood and the sovereignty and the female self-authorship that comes with that, should you choose that. And I think that it's time that single women do have a space where they can share ideas, they can be around other people and talk about the realities of singleness, okay, and how you plan for later life when you're a single woman, how you navigate the world when you're a single woman. And this shouldn't be really a big deal. Apparently it is. In the early days when I went on to TikTok and I would talk about modern single womanhood, okay, oh my goodness. I still get it now. And it's quite interesting. I wrote an article, or an essay rather, on Substack about why single female happiness threatens people. Why do people feel so threatened when a single woman talks about her happiness? Okay, we're totally okay with women sharing proposal footage, engagement footage, weddings, bridal showers, baby showers, gender reveal. We're okay. In fact, the algorithm loves it. But when a single woman talks about her own happiness and her life, it's a problem. It's offensive. You know, well, there are a number of reasons, structural and social reasons, and I talk about that in the essay on Substack. But my point is that there needed to be a space for this. I didn't see spaces where I would not be inundated with, this is what you could do to get a man. This is why a man does not want you. When in actual reality, I don't give a heck. Because I don't orient my life around men at all, in my personal life or in my professional life, right? Yeah, it's not a thing for me, okay? Marriage and motherhood are not things that I aspire to experience. And I haven't planned, never have. I've never desired to be anybody's wife. And it was time to create a space whereby, from the lens of a modern single woman who is not insecure, okay, who is sane, mature, sober-minded, able to articulate my thoughts, my wants, my needs, it was time to create a space where similar thinkers could gather. And so that's really why I talk so often and so much about single womanhood in the modern world, what that means, what that feels like, what it looks like. And what I hope to be able to do is share the myriad and the varied stories of modern single womanhood, okay? Because I think it's important. As I say, we're quite okay with marriage and dating being the predominant the predominant topic of content for women. And I think there's actually a lot of myths, quite frankly, that can be debunked about who single women are, why they're single. Not that it matters, by the way. I'm really not a fan of justifying why you're single or explaining that to other people. But there are so many stories that are completely untold in the grand canvas of what womanhood actually is. So that's why I've always focused on single womanhood. I think there's a space for it. I think there's a need for it. It also represents where I am at in life and have been. I'm not new to this, right? I'm not somebody who attempted to follow the script at all. I'm always very honest with that. It's not like I failed the test. I never took the test in the first place, right? Didn't enter the room and didn't sit down for the test. And I think that perspective is not often shared. Now, I understand that some of my ideas and my worldview can feel confronting. I get a lot of DMs from women who say, I hated your content when I came across it. They were very triggered. They used those words, not me. They felt uncomfortable. They felt confronted by some of the things that I have said and shared, which reflect my worldview about the importance, for example, of women showing up as full adults in life, psychologically and financially. That's usually one of the ones that, gets the gums flapping, as it were, right? Is when I talk about that kind of thing. But here's the thing, I'm not going to dumb myself down. Definitely not going to be doing that. And this is a space for people who like to think, people who can hold complexity and nuance as well, right? Because the reality of life is that it is complex and it is nuanced. And so I'm not going to be flattening gender discourse, for example, if we do touch upon that. And of course, it should go without saying that there's never any malintent or an intention to be offensive. But the truth of the matter is sometimes, I have shared things that are objectively true, by the way, okay? But what they do, hearing it destabilizes everything that you might have believed to be true, but also how you have formed your identity. And therefore, the big life decisions that you've made have been based on those beliefs. Trust me, like I said, when I sat down in those meetings with those elders, I realized everything I had thought was true was wrong. Yeah. Even though I'm somebody who's read the Bible at least 30 times, cover to cover, right? I would have said I was a fairly competent studier of the Bible, not just a reader. And so I was even confused. I was completely, speechless in more ways than one. Okay, so I get what it's like when certain things are presented to you, or you realize certain things, or somebody, is rattling your entire foundation. So yes, that's what we are going to be doing here. And of course, this is, I guess, a debut of sorts on YouTube, to be able to speak in longer form on a platform that is often more easily accessible for people who enjoy thinking and talking about these types of ideas. So you can check Substack. So do subscribe. I write on Substack Monday to Friday. So yeah, go ahead onto Substack. That's where I can talk to you. I can tell you about upcoming podcast episodes as well. I'm hoping to do some meetups this year because people have been asking for some unpunishable meetups. And so Substack will be the best place because I can just drop everybody an email. Okay, so until next time, stay unpunishable.